here in studio with Moe Odele, who is the founding partner at Vazi Legal and the founder of an amazing platform that's doing some great stuff in Africa, Scale My Hustle. Moe, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. I've been looking forward to this, actually.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm flattered. I'm flattered. So, what's it like for you in DC as someone who kind of came up in Nigeria and then came over, I believe, to get your or to go to law school, right, at Columbia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I recently moved to DC only a couple of months ago. And I used to be in New York, which is great. And I just thought I just wanted to do a lot more international work focused on Africa. New York is fantastic. There's a lot of international work there, but not so much focused on the continent. So I'm new in DC, like maybe about 3 months or so.
Okay.
So the idea is to just explore and just see. And then your question to what is like, that's an interesting question because when I first moved here, it was just trying to figure out what was going on. But over time, it was easy to just come across people who were interested in kind of things I was interested in, right? Which is basically just innovation in Africa, very simple. And DC was just the place for me. I found myself from New York coming all the time to DC for conferences and just meeting people. And I just thought, you know what, let me just make the move. So far, so good. I've met pretty interesting people. I like the crowd. And yeah, it's very international.
Yeah, fantastic. And when I first started this podcast, it actually wasn't just focused on Africa. It was just emerging in frontier markets. Yeah. I just kind of personally became fascinated by what was happening in Africa because when I was doing interviews with entrepreneurs there, it was just so different than what we were being presented with in the mainstream media, which is this one-sided narrative of just war, poverty, and disease. And so as I've kind of built up this media company, was like, okay, I need to go on the continent. Should I go to Lagos, Nairobi, maybe Joburg?
Oh, I remember seeing you in Lagos.
Yes. It's so funny going to Lagos because when I get on the plane, people kind of look at me. They're like, "Are you sure? Like, you want to come in?" But then I realized that DC is actually a fantastic place if you're doing business in Africa and you want kind of your international hub. DC is a fantastic place to be.
I agree. Yeah, it is.
Africa business community is very small, right? And so it's very, very easy to get plugged in once you start, meeting a couple of people here. But I do want to kind of start off with just on your story because what I see from afar in your Twitter feed is just pure hustle, unbelievable hustle. And so was that natural for you, or how did that get instilled?
I want to say that I want to say it's natural, but okay. I don't also want to come off as dishonest. But it's very deliberate in the sense that when I was living in Nigeria, which was about 5 years ago, I knew I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew what I didn't want to do. And what I didn't want to do was sit in the law firm just poring over documents day in, day out. I was bored out of my mind. So I knew that there was something else to be done. And at the time, I had provided services to different startups in, just very, very basic like company registration over a couple of years. And as interesting as it would sound or unbelievable, 5 years ago, the startup ecosystem in Nigeria, which is where I'm from, was actually very different from what you have now. It was, people were doing stuff, but very fragmented. So most of the people who were doing stuff were mostly people who had lived in the US or somewhere else before and then come back home and say, you know what, this is a solution that could work. There was no startup community as it is now. The entire growth that you can see happened in the last 3 or 4 years or so, something like that, or maybe even less. So as at then, so 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was nothing like that. And then I would look, I would always watch movies and look at things and be like, this whole vibrant startup ecosystem happening in Silicon Valley, this is really interesting and fascinating. And at the time I was applying to school, I was applying to schools in California because I just really wanted to know about Silicon Valley. And I got into a couple of schools. In California, and I just couldn't fund my education that year, and then I didn't go. And by the next year, I thought, you know what, let me try it again. And then somehow I ended up in Colombia, which was also great for me. But when I got to Colombia again, I was really focused on how do you take all this innovation that is happening around the world and use it to just solve basic problems on the continent. And when I say the continent, I'm referring to Africa. And the reason why that was fascinating for me is because there's this whole narrative about Africa kind of leapfrog, Africa is rising. We've had a whole series of different narratives, come and go. But the truth is, when you look at the basic problems, people are still hungry. People are still, out of jobs. People still don't have access to healthcare. So no matter how much you're leapfrogging or whatever, rising, the basic problems are still there, and the statistics don't lie. So for me, it was like, okay, so how do we actually take out all the noise, right? Like just tear apart all the noise and just focus on what the main issues are. The main issues are, poverty, hunger, lack of education, lack of healthcare, and then how do we start building companies that can actually solve these problems? So that was it for me, and everything I've done is just really centered around that entire piece, regardless of how the form or the way the form and the way I have done it is just based off my experience and my own education, but still that's just the core for me. So again, and then you also have to balance all of that social good, and this is something I always tell people all the time, that you might want to save the world and all of that, but you also need to be able to make money. So for me, it's like, how do you combine this thing I have for impact, and at the same time, be able to earn a living. So everything you see around the hustle is just me trying to figure out how to balance that, right? It's not been easy, but it gets easier as you go. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, startups in Africa is so interesting because it's a world that exists in parallel to the need for capital in other areas like infrastructure. Certainly healthcare is a big problem that, healthcare startups, I think they have their place, but there are aspects of the problem that you can't entrepreneur your way out of. Like they're too big. They require, roads is a perfect example of like a problem that like an entrepreneur can't just, start a company to solve that. That's a top down thing that needs to be solved. And so when you mention impact, do you feel like that conversation is kind of been hijacked by some people? Because there are so many, I shouldn't say so many, there are some VC funds that invest in Africa, and all because they invest in Africa, they say they're an impact fund, right? So do you feel like that conversation of impact investing has kind of been hijacked?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's been hijacked in different ways, in different ways in different places. And just for context, before I started Vazi Legal, I worked for an impact investing consulting firm, and we did a lot of work around the world. So we're geography agnostic. So we did a lot of work in Southeast Asia, we did a lot of work in the UK, we did a lot of work in the US, and even the Middle East. But one of the things that was clear was that in terms of like the impact conversation, a lot of the impact conversation was happening in the US and in the UK. And then so what would happen is, or maybe in Europe, let me say, and then what will happen is you have people who are impact experts, go to other places and say, this is what impact looks like. But for me, what was really apparent was that impact looks differently depending on the context you're in, right? Like, so whatever is impact in India is very different from what is impact in Kenya. And until we begin to understand that conversation, there is no general definition of, impact or impact investing. And the reason I say that is because, again, this issues, they manifest differently in different places, right? So if you have healthcare challenges in the US, everybody knows that it's a, broken healthcare system. We all know that. But the healthcare challenges in the US are very different from the healthcare challenges in, say, Nigeria, for instance. Right. So people in the US are thinking about like, insurance and stuff like that and access. In Nigeria, we're thinking about, infrastructure. We're thinking about, so the problems manifest differently. So for me, in terms of like impact, I there's something I always say, and I'm like, say a lot of VC firms just do this thing where they, impact washing, where it's just like you just wash it with so much lingo, and then you talk about the sustainable development goals, and that's it. Yeah. But if you don't understand the context of where you are investing, what's going to happen is you're just going to literally waste your time. Right. Literally, especially so if you want to be an impact investor in a context, I think a lot of resources has to go into understanding the problem that you're trying to solve and what you're trying to achieve. And until you understand, because when you understand those problems, you can see exactly how the problem manifests, and then you can know the particular companies that are solving it. And why this is important is because you also now have a lot of startups just springing up because they want to get money from impact investors. They just basically replicate what impact investors have historically invested in another country, replicates it in another in maybe Nigeria, where this is not a business that we even need to exist, right? It doesn't need to exist, but because impact investors like it, it exists, and then they raise money for it, and then but in terms of like the actual impact, it's zero.
Yeah, but that I think that localization context is actually a more of a differentiating factor for African startups, and I think they realize. I think a lot of countries in Africa, the culture is a little, it makes people too humble with their startups and with their ideas, where a lot of Western companies or from Europe or China looking to enter these markets, I mean, they don't have the same kind of localization advantage that some of these startups on the ground have.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of Western companies are much better off acquiring local companies that have figured out and solved for the local markets, which is not an easy thing, especially in somewhere like Nigeria, where like there's like the top of the market, there's the bottom of the market, and then the middle is just so fragmented. There's all these different and so I think that a lot of African entrepreneurs need to have more confidence in what they're doing. Yeah. And I think that we'll see the ecosystem rising just as a result of that mindset shift on the ground.
Yeah. I definitely agree with you.
Yeah. And so, the whole idea of bringing Silicon Valley ideas over to Africa and trying to localize it, there's a whole emergence of AI, blockchain, and all these new technologies. But, do you think that there's an actual like practical use case for some of these things? Because especially blockchain, that we're like, there's so many buzzwords thrown out of the different use cases, and certainly remittances makes a lot of sense as a perfect use case for that. But kind of bringing those concepts to reality, I mean, over the next, we'll say 5 years, do you think that some of these like way ahead technologies in Silicon Valley can actually have a practical impact on the ground?
Yes, I think so. And I'm probably biased because, just personally, I'm fascinated with blockchain, AI, and frontier technologies generally. The reason I say that is because a lot of the problems on the continent are big problems that require big solutions, right? And they are problems that require efficient solutions as well. So what is happening with frontier technologies is that, you get more efficient with, we'll talk about the negative sides, but positives first of all. So you get really efficient with the solutions you're trying to achieve. Another thing is also time. It saves you time. See, a lot of countries on the continent have been behind for far too long. And in order for you to be able to catch up, you need that cheat. You just need this cheat code, which I think a lot of frontier technologies bring. Now, specifically in terms of use cases, blockchain, for instance, fascinating concept. The reason why it's important in a context like Nigeria is because of the core of blockchain, which is transparency. Now, Nigeria loses a lot because of the trust deficits in the country. So this trust deficit manifests in different things, from business relationships to personal relationships, right? To even perception in terms of like how the outside world perceives you just because you're Nigerian.
Right.
So when you think about the fact that a technology like blockchain exists, and the core tenet of that technology is transparency, that it begins to give you a currency that is scarce in a country like Nigeria. So that trust currency, right? So people are like, okay, fine. I don't probably trust you one-on-one, and I don't have to trust you, but I trust this technology. So because of that, we can do this business transaction. And then by the time you think about it, and then you expand it to B2C, banks to customers, customers to customers, you begin to see that, okay, fine, if we're using this technology, our customers trust us more, and then we can scale better. So in terms of like blockchain, so for me, the use case for blockchain in different countries is not really about the specific things they're doing with the blockchain. It's really about the fact that, do people understand this technology, and then how does that change cultural attitudes that have kept people locked in, under development. That's how I think about it.
Yeah.
And then with something like AI, for instance, which, there are fantastic use cases all over the world, right? But I think, interestingly, I'm very particular about the application of AI to agriculture and food security. The reason, so there's so many things you can use AI for, but in the context of Africa, I think that's basically it for me. And I think that we have to begin to focus on that area, and for different reasons, right? The first one being that Africa as a country provides a lot of the food that the rest of the world eats. So in order for us to be able to provide even more, right? Like, you're thinking about things like you can use artificial intelligence to predict to predict different seasons and how a particular crop is going to do, and if you have a disease pending and stuff like that. All those things that actually reduce the productivity of farmers, you can actually solve it with AI. I have a client who is basically a company that uses artificial intelligence to predict the farming yields of farmers, and farmers can actually take those details to the bank and get loans. Historically, banks don't understand, like, they don't lend to farmers because they don't understand. So they're just like, oh, well, you have data that shows, okay, based off XYZ, these are the yields I'm expecting, and based off this, I can, you can lend me money. So all those very simple things I think are very important. So in terms of like AI blockchain, that's what I think it is. But I think that in terms of the particular use cases, we now need to figure out like where is this going to be the most valuable. And personally, like I said, it's just a personal bias. For blockchain, I think it's most valuable in decreasing the trust deficit. And then for AI, I think it's most valuable in agriculture and food security.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that the whole conversation of leapfrogging, it has to move beyond just mobile money and FinTech, because I think there's a quote that has been in my mind for a while. I think you said it. I don't know if you said it, but you give a poor farmer or a poor person in Africa a mobile wallet, they're so poor. They still have $0 in the bank account.
Yeah, I did say that.
I think the ability to start collecting data on the person and give them access to credit, I mean, that's certainly a game changer and something that is still playing out very, very slow. But I think, in my opinion, Internet of Things can have a huge impact on agriculture.
Oh yeah, that's true.
In terms of increasing crop yield. Although, the last episode we had was with this guy, Andrew Mack, who's working on a solution to fix the supply chain problem of helping farmers get their crops to market. And, the conversation we had is around the fact that all these foundations are focusing on how do we help farmers increase the yield. But it doesn't matter if you're increasing yield if you can't get those crops to market, right? So I think that's a big problem. And I am personally biased towards VR as a big impact to the market, solely for the fact that I think that one of the biggest problems in the world right now is a lack of empathy. And we have all these people sitting in these boardrooms that are making decisions, and these multinationals have gotten so big around the world that it's hard for them to have empathy for their broader stakeholders. Yeah. And so I see VR as a way to communicate what's actually happening on the grounds in the way that is able to help people develop the empathy and develop a perspective of what's it actually like to be a farmer in Africa, or what's it actually like to be on the ground in Hong Kong protesting right now. And so, that's media bias, but that's where I see the biggest impact.
Yeah, and that's understandable. I totally understand.
Of course. I don't know. I mean, certainly AR is interesting. I mean, I don't know, maybe glasses can help farmers with detect diseases in crops or something.
Maybe.
I don't know, but I think certainly blockchain with how value is stored and kind of moves around the continent. I mean, if you're able to move value more efficiently, I mean that could do so much. And combining that with the new Continental Free Trade Agreement, that's kind of frees up the actual physical moving of goods and the tariffs that go along with that. I think we can really unlock some value and some growth in Africa with all that.
I totally agree.
Yes. But I think the one thing that can certainly unlock value in Africa and help growth much quicker is how do we get more capital to flow into these markets? And I think there are a couple problems. I think one is something I've heard you mention before, where it's like you have all these people like yourself that hustle in the diaspora and that have migrated or come over here to the U.S. or Europe and built their way up into the upper middle class and want to invest back on the continent, but there's not a lot of visibility into where do I put this capital? Where's the opportunity? How do I connect with a fundable project that I can actually trust the entrepreneur that's operating on the ground? So I think that's one problem, and I don't know why there hasn't been a platform that's built or that has more traction to kind of connect the two.
Yeah. And that's really interesting because, we had mentioned Scale My Hustle earlier, but when I started Scale My Hustle, what we're trying to do, we're trying to build a Tinder for investors and
Okay. I
and
like that.
investors. Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Okay.
But we discovered a very serious problem. So on the outset, it was just me thinking about the technology before thinking about, the problem I was trying to solve. So it was like, build this platform, put people on it. It's like a deal sourcing platform and whatever, really just a dating site for investors and investee companies. And it was very easy for us to just see, okay, fine. So I had, as a lawyer, I had like a due diligence checklist. And I was like, okay, before anybody comes on this platform, these are the things you have to have done. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the time I started speaking to people, went on the field, so my staff came back to me and they're like, this is not going to work. So this is after like 3 months of, talking to people, having interviews. And I'm like, what are you guys saying? And they said, because your due diligence checklist, nobody's going to pass it. And I was like, okay, so what do we do? So now we started doing the hard problem of just putting out content. So now you have a lot of entrepreneurs on the continent, and this is not me trying to color every entrepreneur with the same brush. But the thing is, a lot of investing in companies and the whole VC model and all of that is still pretty new on the continent. And because of that, people are used to just running their businesses how they want to run it, right? Like, so the reason why a lot of startups in the US are structured the way they are is because investors basically would ask for it. Your investor will ask you what your, for your board documents, they'll ask you for, what are you doing? They'll ask you for your marketing plans. They'll ask you for all those things, and then you just have to do it. So like, really, even if you were too lazy to do it, just because you have somebody's money, you just want to do it. So now, so one of the things that we said was, well, like, if you want to be able to bring in outside capital into the continent, there's a translation problem, because the way the startups or the companies run on the continent is very different from the way these investors are used to investing in companies. So they ask a particular startup maybe on the platform for XYZ documents and they don't have it. So we said, okay, fine, you know what, before we build this Tinder for investors and investees, why don't we start with the hard work of education, which is basically saying, what does, just basically starting from scratch. And it blew my mind to find out that there was nothing like that. So Scale My Hustle grew into a community of about 20,000 entrepreneurs in less than 1 year.
Wow.
And the reason...
And are all of them on the continent?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, most of them on the continent. So I would say about 70% on the continent, and the rest are like Africans in diaspora. And then, it grew like that. And the reason why it grew that fast, because people from the outset had no idea I was even involved, because people will say, oh, it's because Moe has like a large social media presence. It wasn't that, because people, even up till now, a lot of people still don't know that I was involved in that project. I just started talking about it personally, now. But it grew because it was such a need, like, basic things. And it was, I call it the bias of obviousness. This was just an obvious problem, and then nobody was just solving it. So you had people just doing things in fragments. But it was crazy to me that as a startup in Africa, there was nowhere I could go to and just find resources and say, if I want to properly structure my startup and set myself up for scale, these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things I need to do. And it was just, crazy. So that's how we started. And hopefully one of the things we will do again is to evolve into this, this deal matching platform that we wanted to do. And through Scale My Hustle, what has happened is, because we're interacting with entrepreneurs every day, we're having workshops, we're having seminars, we're having conferences, small, large, medium size, whatever. We're seeing what the problems are. And for me, it's just fascinating. We have so much data that it's just like, oh my God, what are we going to do with all this information? So we're just seeing what people are going through and the day-to-day problems that people actually, face when they're trying to build their company. So this is not data like, that is just random. This is data that you're getting from people real time as they're actually doing the hard work of building. So right. I think once we're done with this whole data collection stage, maybe for another couple months or even a year, then we would build out this platform.
Yeah, but I think you're solving there are two capital problems in Africa. There's actual money, but there's human capital, which is almost a bigger problem. Yeah. That's why Africa needs its diaspora right now, really bad, to come back to the continent and actually start a business. Yeah. Well.
I mean, people always ask me, and they're like, see, Moe, when are you moving back to Nigeria? And I say, I spend so much time in Nigeria. And what do I mean by that? I'm here in the US, but I'm constantly in Nigeria in the sense that, I'm constantly doing projects in Nigeria. Like,
right.
I'm constantly working with entrepreneurs on the continent. I'm constantly on social media. The only thing I talk about is Nigeria, right? Like, so I'm like, I might not be there physically, but I'm, definitely there.
Your soul is always there. Yeah.
So but yeah, I totally agree with you. And then for me, one of the things I always tell, because separately, I've been speaking to a couple of friends, and we're trying to put together like a diaspora fund, and now a lot of people have tried to do that before. One of the things I was telling them is, see, it doesn't even have to be just money, right? Like, so if you have specific skill sets that you can provide some mentorship with, support to startups, that would be great. So I'm talking to people now, and this is really fascinating for me. So separately, as I scale my hustle at Vazi Legal, I'm a partner at an early stage investing fund. It's called Tip Hub. It's pretty new.
I know Chika.
Yeah. Oh, you know Chika?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So Chika and Bayer are my partners, and then we're raising a fund, just a small fund, diaspora fund.
And is that with diasporas as LPs or to invest in diasporas?
Diasporas as LPs.
Okay.
So basically people like me, people like Chika, people like, everybody else that we know who has some spare cash, put it together in a fund and then invest in businesses on the continent. So yes. So one of the things I was discussing with my partners really is it doesn't necessarily also have to be money. You can provide mentorship support. So even if you're here working in Google or working in Amazon, wherever you're working, or Facebook or whatever, you can actually sit down in California or Seattle or DC and still be able to provide that first level, mentorship, close support to a particular startups. If you're a product person, you can begin to provide that kind of support. That's support that people need. And again, people need it a ton, because I can say it again from Scale My Hustle. So in terms of like diaspora, because there are many reasons why a lot of people are still stuck here. For instance, I have student loans to pay, and I know if I move back to if I move back to Nigeria, I mean, by the time you do the conversion, it doesn't even make any sense. So there's so many reasons, personal, economic reasons why people are here. But one of the things I also preach, instead of just telling people, oh, move back, is what are the simple things you can do, right? Like, even from where you are, even if it's just giving somebody else access to markets, right? Like, there's a startup here that needs an inroad into getting the clients in the US, you can do that. Very basic things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think, the problems in Africa are so big and complicated.
Yeah.
And it certainly, I think mentorship is solving a big problem, because I think we need to just raise the consciousness of people on the ground in Africa. I think that's what's needed, and I think that's going to happen from diaspora coming back. And I mean, things like this, like more kind of media being created that kind of people on the ground can relate to and can learn from. And so I think what you're doing with that is fantastic, both from the fund and mentorship side. But I do want to talk about fund structure, right? Because I do know that. So from what I've seen, and I think this is common consensus, that VC funds, the 10-year life cycle is like doesn't really work for Africa. It's not long enough. Like deals take a lot longer in Africa, right? You have to have multiple dinners, and I think that, and I would love to get your opinion on the pledge fund versus a blind pool structure. Like I don't feel like blind pool is the right structure for a VC fund in Africa. I feel like pledge fund makes a lot more sense. But like with your fund, like are you structuring it in any unique way, or like how do you advise kind of your VC clients that look to place capital?
Okay, so on the flip side, so there's two things, right? So aside running Vazi Legal, where I provide legal services to VC funds, this Tip Hub, which is still, we putting together our fund. So in terms of our fund structure for Tip Hub, that's still under wraps.
Okay,
but
got it.
But in terms of like advice to VC funds, the truth is these funds have been structured way before they come to me. So even before they have things on paper, so they have LP commitments and they know exactly what they want to do. So what I tell them is this: if you have this particular fund structure, that's fine. But what you should be able to do is make sure all your fund documentation and your fund structure itself is adaptable. Because as you start to invest, you begin to see different things, and then you want to put yourself in that position where you can adapt. That's very different from somewhere in the US where funds are just doing, because there's been years and years of doing exactly the same thing, right? So people already know this is how things work and all of that. When you're coming to a place where people are still experimenting and people are still trying to figure out what's going on, the basic thing that you need to understand is that your fund structure has to be adaptable. So in terms of like the structure, honestly, I don't think this structure is better than the other. One of the things I actually even advise my clients is multiple structures. And what I mean by that is, depending on the kind of startup you're investing in and the stage where they are, you have to be able to provide structures that are flexible enough to accommodate the company and the company's growth and the type of growth the company is having. That's also another thing that's very important. The type of growth you see with African startups are very different from the type of growth you see, say, in the US, for instance.
And when you say that, is that because of like the kind of fragmented markets that they're going across? Okay.
Yes. So basically, yes. So that's very important. So when you think about it like that, so one of the things I always say is, whatever you're doing, just make sure that you have a fund structure that is flexible, that you can bring people back to the table and say, okay, this is not working or this is working, so what do we do about this? And it's very and I think that also for people like me who are really, because I was joking, I was telling my associate, and I said, you know what, we are the people actually just really writing history right now. Like, history is happening right now, because that document that you are drafting, so from time to time we have like some very bespoke fund structures for clients, and I say that document that you're doing right now, somebody else is going to pick it up a couple of years and then build on top of it, right? So you have to be super responsible what you're doing. And they're like, oh, Mo, you're taking things too personal. I'm like, yeah, but that's it, because we're literally creating stuff from scratch. These are things that don't exist on the continent, so we're doing things from scratch. So everything you're doing, you have to understand that you are literally writing history. So I think when you think about it that way, you begin to know that it's very important for people to stay adaptable and flexible. So when I have fund documents that have very strong language and all of that, I just advise my clients and say, you know what, this is great the way it is, but we also need to build in flexibility into this, because it's important. We're all learning on the process, and as things happen, you want to be able to go back to the drawing board and say, you know what, let's change this.
Okay. Yeah, I've learned a lot about different startup and company structures all around the world from doing this podcast. Like in China, for example, Western investors, they never directly invest in the domicile. It's domiciled like Hong Kong or maybe Delaware or Singapore. Then there's all sorts of structures that gets them into China. And so, with that being said, I do want to get your opinion on just one slice of one issue. So, referring to Jumia, do you think the argument that because they're domiciled in France, they're not technically or maybe it's Germany, they're not technically an African company?
They are registered in Germany with operations in France, something like that.
Yeah.
I would give my personal opinion, right?
Yes.
And this is what is an African company, right? Like, what is a US company? A US company is a company that is active in the US and solving a problem in the US, right? So when you think about it that way, if a company is on the continent and is solving problems on the continent, then it's just might as well be African, right? Like, because when you think about it, think about the biggest when you think about the biggest companies on the continent, a lot of them are not run by Africans that have that kind of everybody. I don't know when people say Jumia is not an African company, I don't really know what the argument is or what the argument should be, but when we think about it, it was basically a company that was set up to solve a problem on the continent, employing people on the continent. How do you know? People say, oh, because the top level staff are not Africans and stuff like that. But if you want to understand the impact of Jumia as a startup on the continent, check the CEOs and COOs of some of the most successful startups on the continent today. You would see that at some points they either started off in Jumia or have some connection with that Jumia somehow, somewhere.
Right.
So I think that in terms of like forgetting who's running the company and all of that, Jumia came in at a point where the ecosystem was still young and all of that, and still sort of like gave the ecosystem some elevation globally. Now, I don't like to, and this is not to to give some credit to Jumia or anything like that, but the truth is we still know that in order for you to be able to have those elevated conversations, you actually still need people like Rockets, to come and do stuff on the continent, and people will start looking and say, oh, if Rockets is here, then there has to be something there. And it's still sad, but that's just the way it is, right? Like, people, there are certain people in the world that have to start looking, for instance, you have, Google coming to do Launchpad Africa, and people are like, oh wow, this is really interesting, Google is here. When you have a Facebook, for instance, opening an office in Nigeria, or then you have the AI Center by Microsoft in Ghana, like, those kind of things. Like, so when those things happen, like, it begins to draw people's attention. So one of the things, has Jumia drawn the attention and helped the growth of the African ecosystem? I would say yes, arguable so. Like, one of the largest shareholder in Jumia is MTN. MTN is a South African company. So for me, if you've come, rolled up your sleeves, try to do work in the continent, whether you fail or you are successful, I think that you might as well be, because that's where you are actually doing work. Yeah.
Well, I think the story yet to be written, because the lockup period still hasn't hit. So we'll see what MTN does after that. But Mo, this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot from this episode. Let's finish this off, I guess, with to all the Western investors and Western people that are looking to do stuff in Africa. What would you say to them? What would your advice be to kind of come over and operate on the continent in the proper way?
So my advice would be, first of all, understand the problem that you're trying to solve, and then also focus on your deal sourcing, right? So how are you finding your deals? If you are finding your deals through the traditional means of deal sourcing, it's going to be quite difficult for you to actually find real impactful companies solving problems. So you have to go outside your circles. You have to really make a conscious effort to understand the terrain. You don't even have to go to Lagos or Nairobi or Joburg to do that, but it's just thinking outside the box in terms of, like, how do I find these deals? There's so many. I was having a conversation with a colleague a couple of days ago, and I said, we're replicating a lot of not only Silicon Valley, startups and ideas, but also the problems. For instance, the amount of funding that has gone to female entrepreneurs on the continent is actually embarrassing, right? And it doesn't reflect the fact that, the high percentage of people who are actually entrepreneurs on the continent are women. So, like, that's mind-blowing to me. And the reason why that is happening, aside the obvious gender bias, is also because these are Silicon Valley's bias in terms of, like, gender bias that is just being replicated on the continent. So I say, as an investor, if you're looking to invest on the continent, you kind of like have to leave aside everything you know about investing, which is a hard thing to do, and just learn. Just say, you know what, I want to understand the context. And I feel before you actually put your money in, understand the even if it's just a tiny problem you're trying to solve. You don't have to say, oh, I want to solve healthcare in Nigeria or whatever it is, but pick a part of the problem and say, okay, data, I want to be able to solve that. Understand why the data problem even exists in the first place. It's very useful, because that way you begin to know the kind of companies you should actually be investing in, because you understand what the root of the problems are. Right. So that's what I'll say.
Awesome. Well, Moe Odele, founder of Scale My Hustle, founding partner at Vazi Legal. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I had fun.
Awesome. Me too.
Awesome.